At 62, Michael Jordan, once the unstoppable force who dominated the court, rewrote NBA history and became the face of global sports, now finds himself at a place few ever imagined. For decades, fans saw him as invincible, the man who flew, the man who never broke, the man who always came back stronger. But behind the highlight reels, the trophies, and the billion-dollar legacy lies a heartbreaking truth that the world is only now beginning to understand. Because the real tragedy of Michael Jordan has nothing to do with the game. It has everything to do with what happened after it. While the public still pictures the champion who hit impossible shots, who carried the Bulls to 6 titles, who refused to lose, those close to him say the real battles didn't begin until the final buzzer of his career sounded. From devastating personal losses to years of emotional isolation, to the inner demons that even greatness couldn't outrun, Jordan has faced a private storm far darker than anything he ever confronted on the court. And as he steps into his 60s, the weight of that history, family heartbreak, fractured relationships, shocking revelations about his time away from basketball, and the consequences of a life lived under relentless pressure is finally coming into focus. The world thought Michael Jordan walked away untouched, undefeated, immortal, but the truth is far more human and far more painful. What happened to him after the spotlight faded will leave fans stunned, and it reveals a side of Jordan that few have ever seen, one defined not by triumph, but by tragedy. When people look back at Michael Jordan's career, they see perfection. The 6 championships, the MVP trophies, the impossible competitiveness that transformed him from a great athlete into a global icon. But what rarely gets discussed, what Jordan himself spent years refusing to talk about, is the emotional toll that came with becoming the most famous athlete on earth. Because from the very beginning, Jordan's rise wasn't just fast, it was explosive. One day he was a promising young player at North Carolina. The next, he was the face of an entire league. Sponsorships, non-stop media attention, cameras everywhere he went. Pressure stacked so high no human could ever breathe under it. And yet, he kept winning. On the outside, that looked like invincibility. On the inside, it began shaping a life built around isolation. Those closest to him say Jordan struggled early with the unspoken rule of greatness. The higher you rise, the fewer people you can truly trust. Friends from childhood drifted away. Teammates respected him, but rarely felt close to him. Even at the height of the Bulls dynasty, Jordan felt like he lived inside a bubble, where every relationship was filtered through fame, money, or expectation. But the biggest emotional blow came long before the championships were over, something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The murder of his father, James Jordan, in 1993. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was a rupture. His father had been his anchor, the one person he could truly be himself with. Losing him in such a violent, sudden way shattered Jordan in a way that the public never fully grasped. While fans were stunned to see him retire the first time, those closest to him knew he wasn't just tired of the game, he was broken. To escape the grief, he stepped into baseball, chasing a childhood dream he once shared with his father. But even there, the pressure followed him. Critics mocked him. Fans questioned his motives. And instead of healing, Jordan felt the weight of the world closing in tighter. When he returned to basketball, he reclaimed his throne, but not his peace. Every victory felt more like expectation than joy. Every championship parade felt like a performance he was required to give. Inside, the humor, the spark, the youthfulness that defined early Jordan had dimmed. And as he crossed into his 40s and then his 50s, the struggle didn't disappear. It intensified. The more time passed, the more Jordan realized that his identity had been built entirely around winning. When the game stopped, he was forced to face the question that had haunted him for years. Who is Michael Jordan when he isn't competing? It was a question he didn't have an answer to. And it led to decisions in his personal life. Relationships strained, his marriage collapsing, distancing himself from people he once cared about. That would create some of the deepest regrets of his life. People saw the billionaire, the owner, the legend. They never saw the man wrestling with a lifetime of pressure, grief, and the emotional isolation that came from being the greatest. By the time he reached 62, The cracks that had been hidden for decades finally began to show in a way no one could ignore. For most of his life, Michael Jordan was convinced of one thing: any problem could be defeated with focus, discipline, and sheer willpower. It's the mindset that made him unbeatable on the court. But it also became the very thing that complicated his personal life once the spotlight dimmed. Because off the court, Jimmy's strength doesn't look like scoring 45 points or hitting a game winner. Strength looks like vulnerability. It looks like connection. It looks like letting people... And that was something Jordan struggled with more than anything. As the years passed, after his second retirement, the walls he built around himself only grew taller. He kept his circle small, so small that people close to him would describe him as both surrounded and lonely at the same time. Crowds adored him, but he had very few true confidants. In private moments, Jordan would admit that the pressure of perfection had robbed him of the simple ability to relax around people, to trust, to let himself be flawed. Those closest to him noticed a pattern. Jordan's emotional wounds often surfaced as anger. His competitive fire didn't fade with age. It simply lacked an outlet. And for a man whose identity was carved out of dominance, the transition to a quieter life felt like a loss he didn't know how to process. But the most heartbreaking consequences were in his family life. Jordan has always loved his children deeply, but his fame placed an invisible distance between them. Everywhere they went, they weren't just kids, they were Michael Jordan's kids. Expectations followed them. Comparisons haunted them. And Jordan, so consumed by his own battles, often didn't realize how heavy that shadow was until years later. Behind closed doors, he would admit that he wished he had been more present, less consumed by winning, less distracted by fame, and more aware of the emotional needs of the people closest to him. Then came the pain he never talked about publicly. Getting older forced him to confront the one thing he spent his entire life running from, his own vulnerability. As he approached 60, Jordan started losing people from his generation, friends, teammates, coaches, mentors. The world he dominated began fading into memory. And with every loss, he felt the same feeling he experienced when his father died. A hollow ache that success could do nothing to fill. The grief resurfaced again and again. The isolation deepened. And suddenly, the legend who once seemed indestructible began revealing the same fragility the rest of us face. Jordan also struggled with something few people knew about. The relentless voice in his head that told him he was never doing enough, never winning enough, never achieving enough, even after achieving more than any athlete in history. That inner critic didn't retire, even when he did, and as he aged, that voice became louder. The world expected a calm, graceful elder statesman of basketball. Instead, Jordan often found himself restless, dissatisfied, and emotionally unsettled. He'd look back on his life and realize something tragic. He had mastered the art of winning, but not the art of living. The truth became impossible to ignore for decades. Michael Jordan pushed himself to be superhuman. But the cost of becoming superhuman was spending years not knowing how to simply be human. And by 62, the emotional reckoning he had avoided for so long was finally catching up with him. With the spotlight no longer blinding him and the noise of the arena long gone, Michael Jordan entered a chapter of life he was never prepared for: the quiet. For most people, quiet brings peace. For Jordan, it brought everything he had been avoiding for decades. In those still moments, late nights alone, mornings with nowhere to rush to, days without a game to obsess over, the weight of his past choices, losses, and regrets settled in. And although the world still saw him as the billionaire icon, the GOAT, the myth, Jordan himself felt something much more human: the consequences of a life lived at extremes. One of the most painful realizations came as he got older. Championship rings don't hug you back. For years, fame and success filled the space where emotional connection should have been. But as he aged into his 60s, Jordan noticed the toll this took on his relationships. Friends from his early days said he had become more reflective, sometimes even sorrowful, in private conversations. The man who once didn't have a moment to breathe was suddenly surrounded by the very things he used to avoid: reflection, vulnerability, memory. His relationship with his own legacy was complicated. Everywhere he went, people wanted the version of Michael Jordan they saw in clips, the fire, the swagger, the impossible heroics. But the real man, the aging man, felt increasingly distant from that legend. And that gap created its own kind of grief. The older he became, the more he understood that greatness comes with a clock. The cheers fade, the rivalries dissolve, the competition moves on, and the public, without meaning to, begins celebrating the myth more than the man. That realization hit him harder than anyone expected. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Jordan was quietly dealing with things the world didn't see. His health, while never publicly discussed in depth, was no longer bulletproof. Years of physical strain, a lifetime of pushing his body to the brink, left behind aches, pains, and limitations that frustrated him deeply. For a man whose identity was built on physical dominance, feeling his body slow down was emotionally devastating. But the most heartbreaking struggle came from something far more personal. The fear that he had run out of time to rebuild what he had lost emotionally. He looked back at friendships that faded, family moments he missed, and the years he sacrificed to maintain an image of perfection. And for the first time, he truly felt the weight of those sacrifices. People close to him say Jordan began acknowledging things he once refused to admit. How fame isolated him. How competitive obsession shaped his personality. How emotional walls cost him genuine connections. It wasn't anger this time. It wasn't denial. It was something quieter, something more painful, acceptance. And with that acceptance came a truth he could no longer outrun. Being the greatest had made him victorious. But it had also made him lonely. Yes, he had built a legacy that would outlive every other basketball player in history. Yes, he had wealth, recognition, and global admiration. But when the adrenaline faded, when the crowds disappeared, and when he finally sat alone with his thoughts, he realized something he never expected. Greatness can give you everything, except the one thing you need most: peace. By 62, Jordan wasn't just facing the physical realities of aging. He was facing the emotional consequences of a life lived at the highest possible intensity, with no roadmap for what came after. By the time Michael Jordan reached 62, something shifted inside him, something that even he, the most intensely private athlete alive, couldn't keep buried anymore. For decades, he built a fortress around his emotions, showing the world only strength, dominance, and perfection. But age has a way of peeling back layers. It exposes what you've been running from. It forces you to confront what you once buried beneath ambition. And for Jordan, that confrontation was long overdue. In recent years, people close to him noticed a stunning change. The man who once avoided vulnerability began speaking more openly about the things that haunted him. The losses, the regrets, the price of carrying an entire generation's expectations on his back. What he finally admitted, quietly, privately, and painfully, is that his biggest opponent was never another player. It was the life that his greatness created. For years, Jordan believed that his legacy would bring him joy. But sitting in his 60s, he confessed that legacy can feel like a cage. Everywhere he goes, people expect to meet Michael Jordan, the legend, not Michael Jordan, the man. They want the signature intensity, the bold confidence, the larger-than-life spirit. And while he understands it, he's also exhausted by it. What he never said publicly, what he only recently acknowledged to those around him, is that fame did not enrich his inner world. If anything, it strained it. He revealed that the emotional fallout from his father's death, his competitive obsession, and the pressure to maintain an image of perfection left him feeling like he lived two lives. One admired by the world, one haunted in private. He admitted he regrets not repairing certain relationships sooner. Regrets the years he lost to stubbornness and pride. Regrets missing out on simple experiences because he was too busy chasing the next win. But perhaps the most heartbreaking truth he shared is this. He fears he spent so long being the greatest that he forgot how to be happy. He said he sometimes wonders if he will ever find true peace. Peace free from expectation, competition, and the weight of the past. Peace that isn't tied to victory or dominance. Peace that belongs to the man, not the myth, and yet in that vulnerability, something beautiful happened. For the first time in years, Jordan began reconnecting with parts of himself that had been buried beneath decades of pressure. He started reaching out more, reflecting more, listening more, treating each day less like a competition and more like a chance to finally breathe. People who have spoken with him say he's slowly learning to let go, the anger, the perfectionism, the need to control every outcome. He's learning to forgive himself, learning to accept his flaws, learning that aging isn't losing. Sometimes it's healing, but that healing doesn't erase the heartbreak behind his journey. It doesn't change the years he sacrificed or the emotional wounds left behind by a lifetime of, in greatness. It only means that for the first time, Jordan is no longer running from the truth, and the truth he finally revealed, the truth so many fans never suspected, is this. Being the greatest player of all time didn't save him from pain. It didn't shield him from loneliness. It didn't guarantee happiness. In the end, the real tragedy isn't that Michael Jordan grew older or stepped away from the spotlight. The real tragedy is what he had to give up, emotionally, spiritually, personally, to reach heights no one else ever reached.